was like, I thought it was my fault.
Unprofessional.
I thought it was my fault.
How many days ago were you on that?
Like 2 or 3 months. I found out on Saturday, I think, for sure. The marks are just, it was just uploaded this weekend, right? Yeah. Saturday. It was traumatic.
Okay, sorry about those delays. Yeah, okay, so homework 2, assignment 2. So a few of you have emailed us that we decided to release the marks that we had on Friday. There were some people, for various reasons, we couldn't get your code to run, or they were incomplete, or this or that. So if you're in that situation, please email us. I know some of you have already emailed us. Alex and I are sort of trying to work through these things one by one, but we've been busy with other things, so I hope in the next few days we'll be able to get onto that. So, I just apologize, there's a bit of a delay about that. Is that what you guys were going to ask about? Or yeah. We think like Wednesday or Thursday, hopefully. Yeah. I'm not sure. We're just sort of going through as fast as we can. Yeah. Did you submit an incomplete model, or you just? Okay. So maybe. Yeah. It's probably going to be an ongoing thing. Yeah. But you emailed us already, did you? Or yeah. Okay. We'll try to get on it as quick as we can. Yeah.
Okay. Did you give like some date if like if it's not resolved by this date?
A week from now, let's say. Yeah. Now, where were we? Oh, yes. So last, we're getting near the end. So I think this will be the second last lecture, and then we'll just have a bit of, next week there'll be just a bit of a review lecture, and I'll say a bit about the exam format. So now we were talking about the GANs last week, the generative adversarial networks, and these GANs actually illustrate the kind of general principle known as coevolutionary dynamics. So what I thought I would do today is just talk a little bit about evolution and coevolution, and then a little bit about something I've been working on recently, which is evolutionary art using genetic programs and convolutional networks. So this is a little bit of a side, there's a little bit of an extension material, but there is kind of growing interest in these areas, so it's a good thing to learn about. So I'm going to talk a bit about evolutionary computation paradigms, deceptive landscapes, punctuated equilibria, and coevolution both in nature and machine learning. Now this is going to be fairly broad brush. So some universities have an entire courses on evolutionary computation. We don't have such a course here, so that's just why we're trying to kind of teach it in this course. So I'm just going to try to give you a very sort of broad overview of the area. So evolutionary computation, so we saw one example of this so far is these evolutionary strategies, but it's this general framework where we try to use the principles of natural selection to evolve a computational mechanism to perform some particular task. And if normally what happens is we start with a random population of individuals, and then we repeat this cycle of evaluating the individuals, selecting the best ones, and then copying them with some changes, and perhaps putting together different individuals with crossover. So it's always following this general framework, but different paradigms vary according to how you define the reproduction and mutation operators. So this is the example that we saw so far. This is like the hill climbing algorithm we had. We had a champion policy that was, the weights of a neural network, and then we would generate a mutant policy by adding some random noise to the champion. We would compare the champion and the mutant at some task, and then if the mutant does better than the champ, we would adjust the weights of the champ in the direction of the mutant. And so we looked at how this algorithm is applied to backgammon and simulated hockey, and also to some of those OpenAI environments like humanoid walking and so on. So again, this is, there's been renewed interest in this lately. Now, just to make this a little bit more concrete, well, in effect, this is sort of has a population of only two. So you've got a champion and you've got a mutant, and then you adjust the champ and you generate another mutant. So you're always only comparing two things here, but often we compare multiple things at once, so we have a kind of population, and this is just sort of a typical scenario you might have. You have a population of 100 individuals. At every generation, you evaluate all of them and assign them some sort of fitness score. And let's say the 50 with the highest score you keep, and the 50 with the lowest score you eliminate from the population. We call that culling. I assume culling and killing are probably cognate words, but culling sounds a bit nicer somehow. Crossover and mutation. So then the 50 that we have left, we make slight changes to them in order to replace the 50 that we got rid of. And in some cases, if the paradigm allows it, we might take two individuals and kind of make some mixture between them. So there's a long history of work in this area to do with representations of the individuals, mutation operators, crossover operators, and different fitness functions. And the representations broadly fall into these different areas. So again, what we saw before, where we were adjusting the weights of a neural network, there's kind of continuous parameters. So we have a set of parameters, and each one is a floating point number, and we adjust them. So every one of these paradigms kind of has its own phrase that's attached to it. So this somehow got referred to as an evolutionary strategy. Now, then in the 70s, J.J. Holland started looking at bit-string representations. So this was became known as genetic algorithms. Koza started looking at S expression trees, and that became known as genetic programming. And then we're going to look at other systems where you actually evolve the body of a creature as well as the controller using Lindenmayer systems. And these are just 4 different paradigms, and there are others. Now, I mentioned this bit string operators. This is inspired by natural genetics. So the genotype of an organism is built up of 4 base pairs, C, A, G, and T. But Holland said, well, instead of 4, I'll just simplify, because we're working in computers, we'll just use two bits, 0 or 1. So an individual in this genetic algorithm paradigm is just a sequence of zeros and ones. And then you can try to kind of cross them over. So again, this is a gross simplification compared to what happens in real biology. The real human genome is perhaps 3 billion base pairs, but in this setting we only have maybe a few thousand. And somehow this process goes on. When breeding happens, somehow the genomes from the mother and the father get mixed together in this quite complicated way with different chromosomes and so on. But again, we just want a very simple version of it. So the simplest version is like 1-point crossover. So that you treat this bit string as a sequence, and you pick a random point in the middle, and you copy the first half from the one parent and the second half from the other parent. And you can actually, from two parents, you can generate two children this way, or two offspring. I could copy from this one up to that point and then switch to that one, or I could do it the other way around. So often it's done like this with two offspring. Another alternative is 2-point crossover. So here I pick 2 points at random, and I copy from one parent until the first point. Here I copy from this parent, and then I switch to this parent, and then I switch back to that parent, and this is the complement. It often turns out that 2-point crossover works out better than 1-point crossover. I think the reason partly is with 1-point crossover you tend to copy roughly half or a third to 2/3, a sizable chunk from each parent. With 2-point crossover it can sometimes happen that you copy mostly from one parent and then just like a small portion from the other parent, and sometimes that gives a good result. So this is like crossover, and then for mutations, well, we just pick a random bit and change it from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 0. And so this is a kind of diagram of the whole process in action. So well, these aren't bit strings here, they're actually digits up to digit 8, but it's the same kind of principle. If we cross, so maybe this one got a low fitness, so we got rid of it or didn't choose it for breeding, and then maybe this one breeds with that one, and this one also breeds with that one. And you can see this 1-point crossover creating this, and then you may also have a mutation. Sometimes you don't have any mutations, sometimes you may have 1 or 2 mutations. Right? Now, genetic programming, this is COSA. Well, in the 1980s, some people started to say, well, I want my individuals to be some kind of program in a programming language that can be executed, or a function that can be evaluated. Because if you, what I described here, you would also have to specify how to evaluate the fitness of this, and usually it would involve taking that bit string and converting it into something else. So they call this the genotype to phenotype mapping. So that bit string you may use a grammar to turn it into a program, or you may use some sort of blueprint or specification to turn this into something else. But if your individual is one of these kind of S-expression trees, then you don't really have to convert it. It's already in a form that computes a function. So this is where, so this is like a function of x and y as inputs. So if you read this top left-hand tree, this is saying that first you compute the square root of x times y, and then the IFLTE stands for if less than or equal. So if this says if the square root of x plus y is less than or equal to 10, then you return x, otherwise you return x divided by y. So this is a function. Now because it's a function of x and y, we can think of it as possibly making an image. So this, at the end of this lecture, I'm going to be talking about images. And so you could actually, if you had an image with, let's say that the x, you can define an image as having x and y, each pixel has x and y coordinates, and you could say that x and y range, say, from -1 to 1, and depending on the resolution of the image, you could have an x and a y value for each pixel, and if you have a function like this, you can plug in those x and y values, and it would actually draw a black and white image for you, right? This one might not look very nice, but some others might actually look nice, right? And then this one on the right-hand side computes a different function. This says I take the square root of 17 and multiply it by the square root of x. If that's less than or equal to 10, then I return x, otherwise I return x plus y, right? Now, so you can kind of imagine how you might do mutations in this situation. You might randomly change plus into times, or square root into something else, or change x into y, or y into 17, or various things like this. You've got to be a bit careful if you're changing something that's, some of those nodes naturally have one child, some have 2 children, some have 4 children, so you've got to make sure you preserve the right number of children in the tree and things like that, but you can define these things. And what about crossover? Well, this is where it sort of gets interesting. The crossover is done like grafting of trees. So you randomly pick a subtree here, and you randomly pick a subtree here. You chop off that subtree and attach this subtree over to there, and vice versa. So you get these 2 children from those 2 parents. Now, as far as fitness function, I won't go into too many details about this, but these things can sometimes get stuck in local optima, as we kind of discussed previously when we were talking about Boltzmann machines and simulated annealing and backprop. There's always a potential for, if you're trying to minimize something or maximize something, there's always a risk that you'll get stuck in a local optimum rather than a global one. And people have defined various fitness functions and applied certain algorithms to them and measured whether they get stuck and different ways to avoid them getting stuck and all sorts of things. So there's a big literature about this. Now, I've got some videos of these things. I mean, some of you have seen these videos before, but these are just examples of evolutionary strategies. So this was, it's evolutionary strategies have been used to develop faster walks for these IBO dog robots. Greg Hornby did some pioneering work on this, working at Sony Labs, and then some people here in my department, when we were big into this 4-legged RoboCup, kind of extended that and developed some very interesting walks. And sometimes the evolution comes up with things that are surprising, like we were using a dog that was a bit of a later generation from this one, and the parameters of the walk that were being evolved kind of specified this square locus through which the leg would move, and at some point the rectangle got turned upside down. So we were expecting it to go kind of in this kind of motion, like forward, down, back, and up, but it got flipped so that it was going forward, up, and then back and down. So first we thought there was a bug in the system, but in fact it was actually doing this kind of ski Nordic track kind of walk where it was sliding its elbows along the ground, and surprisingly that was actually faster than a normal walk. So this is the other thing about evolution, is sometimes it comes up with novel kind of approaches. And Tak-Fai-Yik extended this to bipedal walking. And sometimes in the case of the Aibo robot, all the evolution was done on board because there wasn't a good enough simulator to simulate all the effects of the thing rubbing on the carpet and so on. But for this two-legged robot, the evolution was done in simulation, but then later tested on an actual robot. Yeah, maybe we could. Maybe it is worthwhile to have a look at a quick video of this. Well, this isn't terribly exciting. This is just, but that's the dog learning to walk. You have to be able to, I mean, you've got to measure the fitness, so you've got to have like a camera that's watching the robot and figuring out how fast it's walking, and that assigns the fitness function and so on. Now, this is an example of the evolved walk for this robot it was tested on a real robot that was developed at the University of Queensland. And Damien's just sort of standing there just in case the robot falls over. But it does get to the point where it's actually walking without him holding it. Yeah. Here's the side view. Yeah. Doing squats there. I didn't. Okay. And then this Greg Hornby, who did this work with the Aibo, later on he was working for NASA and actually used evolutionary algorithms to develop an efficient antenna for a NASA space mission. This was in 2006. Yeah, it turns out like the most, a sort of slightly funny shape like this is actually much more efficient than a straight line or something. So this is a good example of evolutionary computation in action. This thing really did go into space. Okay, so now coevolution. The idea coevolution. The word coevolution doesn't occur in Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, but it does occur in some of his later essays where he's talking about, coevolution of plants and insects and so on, how like an insect will develop a specially shaped proboscis that's just the right shape to go into a particular plant to get the pollen. But interest in coevolution mainly started or became a big thing in 1970 when Eldridge and Gould wrote a paper in which they were talking about gaps in the fossil record. So this was in the early days of evolution, people had this idea that you would, if you dug down for fossils, you would see a sort of slow change in the animals. So, a giraffe, for example, the giraffe we assume is descended from something that probably looked a bit like a horse with a short neck. So they thought if they dug really deep, they'd find something with a short neck and then something with a slightly longer neck and slightly longer. And all these kind of things. They expected to see sort of gradual change in places when they dug. And sometimes you do find that. But in a lot of cases, you see instead these abrupt changes. So there was a lot of debate in the 50s and 60s about this, and some creationists said, well, this proves that evolution is wrong. But these guys wrote this paper in which they gave a number of arguments to explain why we shouldn't be surprised to see these kind of abrupt changes. And they gave actually, first of all, that's what, nearly 50 years ago now. A lot more digging has happened since then, and sometimes you do see places where there is this kind of gradual change. So a well-known example is Liaoning province in northern China, where you can see very nice intermediate forms between dinosaurs and birds, for example, feathered dinosaurs, but that's sort of, a rarity. And Eldridge and Gould gave about 5 different reasons for this, but I'm only going to talk about 1 or 2 of them. So one of them, this is kind of a bit fanciful, but the idea is, evolution is spread out, populations are spread out over different parts of the planet, and sometimes there's these geographic barriers in between different populations which are difficult but not impossible to cross. So if you have a population here, let's suppose, you've got animals here and then you've got some genetically superior animal appears in this location because of, evolution. Well, what's going to happen is first, in the short term, it'll displace the other animals in the same niche in its local area because it outcompetes them. But it may take some large amount of time before it migrates over to other places. So there might be 100 places throughout the world where these animals are living, and if the thing evolves in just one place, when it migrates to another place, it's going to very quickly displace the animals there. So the change might happen slowly in the first place, but it'll happen quickly in the other places. This is one of the arguments. So if you happen to dig here, then you've got lucky and you'll see the gradual change, but it's more likely that you would dig over here, in which case you're going to see the abrupt change. Now, another sort of aspect of this is, what they eventually argue is that evolution proceeds really by what they call punctuated equilibria. So there are some animals that haven't changed in the last 100 million years, like the crocodile or the alligator. The reason they haven't changed is because they've found a perfect ecological niche. They don't have any predators, they don't really have any competitors, and there's no reason for them to change, so they don't change, right? But then they may stay there for a long time, but then something may happen that, so they're at a local optima, basically. But then something may happen, there may be some change, which takes away their niche. So the change might be like a climatic change. Maybe their environment becomes drier or hotter or something like that, but more likely the change could be just because of other species. Some new predator comes into their area that didn't exist before, or the food that they were relying on is not plentiful anymore, or maybe not a predator, but some other animal that's competing with them for the same food. So this effectively pulls the rug out from under them and this is no longer, it changes, from their perspective, it changes the fitness landscape, and this is no longer a local optimum. And then there can be a period of rapid change where they have to improve in order to survive, and then they may go up to another stable niche and they may stay there for a long time. So this is kind of the picture that we get. And so if we're interested in optimization and computation, this is a very interesting picture, because we ask ourselves, well, does the same thing sort of, can we harness the same thing in a computational setting? Okay, now coevolution in nature can be competitive, it can be cooperative, and it can be mixed. So a classic example of competitive coevolution is like a leopard chasing a gazelle, or any kind of predator and prey. So the gazelle has to learn to run faster to escape from the leopard. The leopard has to run faster to catch the gazelle. So that's like a competitive situation, because what's good for the leopard is bad for the gazelle, and vice versa. Then you get these kind of cooperative coevolution, but the classic example there is what I mentioned between insects and flowers. So often, insects change their shape. Insects and flowers both change their shape so that to make it easier for the insect to pollinate the flower. And then there may be some situations where there's sort of a mixture of cooperation and competition. Okay, so now I'm going to look at how these ideas can be applied in machine learning. And so we're going to look at a few different aspects of this. So brain-body coevolution, strategic games, human versus machine, algorithm versus test cases, and finally artist and critic. Okay, so this, this is interesting because it kind of fits in nicely with the... God, I got way too many windows open here. God. Okay, there we go. That's what I'm looking for. Now, this is work by Carl Sims. So this sort of recreates the natural situation sort of nicely. So these two creatures are playing a game in which they're trying to, it's not like one's trying to eat the other, but they're competing for control over that cube that's initially placed in between them. So they have a certain limited amount of time, maybe 30 seconds of simulated time, and whichever one is closest to the cube, at the end of the 30 seconds, if one of them is touching the cube and not the other one, then that one wins, and otherwise, whichever one of them is closest to the cube wins the competition. So, and he evolves both the body and the controller. So he uses this thing called the Lindenmayer system to generate the body, and a kind of neural network to do the control. And you can see what happens. It's like this creature with the two arms does pretty well, and then you get something with one arm that kind of... But then when two of them go against each other, it becomes a bit chaotic.
What are they trying to do? Are they trying to touch the cube the longest? Or
They need to be closest to the cube at the end of 30 seconds.
Oh.
And then you get this kind of gorilla-like creature that just kind of monsters the other one, but then this long arm thing beats the gorilla, and the gorilla kind of storms off in disgust. Okay. So that's kind of interesting because he's evolving the brain and the body together. Now, some people criticize this work because they said it's entirely in simulation. How do you know if this would really work in reality. So then other people like Hudlibson said, okay, well, we'll evolve a creature virtually, and then we'll 3D print it. So this is like the early days of 3D printing, where 3D printers cost $15,000 even second hand, and it cost $100 just to print something, and so on. But it was sort of, and it's a very simple task. It's just evolved to try to walk along a carpet as fast as possible, but or some sand, but you can actually verify that the thing really works in reality. Okay, so that's one area that naturally lends itself to coevolution. Another area is like strategic games. So we looked already at backgammon, and if you look at also games like chess and Go, there's a certain, if these games are learnt by self-play, this adds a certain benefit to the learning process. The fact that you're learning against someone who's also learning actually kind of helps you to get out of local minima and learn quicker. So these games are sometimes, chess sometimes was learned with humans against machines, sometimes by self-play. There's been work where humans co-evolve against machines. So this was work that was done by some colleagues of mine many years ago. They were using this Tron game from that 1980s movie, and this was sort of the early days of the World Wide Web, and they had this background process where agents were playing against each other, and then the agents that did well in that process could come forward and play against the humans. Now, another kind of application for coevolution is where is kind of coevolution of an algorithm and some test cases for that algorithm. So this was work that was done by Danny Hillis in the early 1990s. So he was looking at, the task that he was looking at was sorting networks. So this is situations where you have a fixed number of inputs, then you want to sort them really fast, and you want to build, so if you want to sort 1 billion items, obviously you want to use merge sort or quick sort or something like that. But here we have a fixed number of items, but we're willing to build dedicated hardware to do the sorting. And sometimes these circuits are based on this idea of comparisons. So what this picture actually is showing is there's 16 items here that need to be sorted, and every time you see a connection like this, what this means is you compare this item with that item, and if they're out of order, you swap them, right? So you compare these two and swap if necessary, and then these, and so on. And it turns out that if you do this particular sequence of comparisons and swaps, this guarantees that no matter what order the items come in on the left, they will actually be sorted when they come out on the right. Yeah, and so this example here, I think, was designed by, so the early sorting networks like this were designed by humans. This is from one of Knuth's books from the 1960s, and there is a way to check. It's sort of interesting. How can you check? If I claim that this will sort any sequence, how can you test whether that's really true? Well, naively, you might think that you have to test every possible permutation of 16 items, which is quite a large number. But there's actually a little trick to this. If you have a sorting algorithm that's based on comparisons, you actually only need to test every possible combination of zeros and ones. And it's not obvious, but there's a theorem that says that if it sorts any combination of zeros and ones correctly, then it'll sort anything correctly. And so that actually cuts it down to 2 to the 2 to the 16, which is 65536, which is quite manageable. But if you're talking about doing a genetic algorithm and a fitness evaluation, it could be quite expensive to do. If you need to do this 65,000 times for every fitness evaluation, that could be quite expensive. And if we wanted to sort more items, it would get even more expensive. So you can really only afford to test on some subset of strings. And so what, well, basically what Hillis originally did was he said, okay, well, I'll just generate a random set of strings to be sorted, and that'll be used for my fitness evaluation. But he found that converged to a local optimum that was not as good as the human solution. And so then what he did is he said, I haven't gone into the details of the evolution, but you can kind of figure this out for yourself. If you've got 2 of these and you want to cross them over, you just kind of draw a line randomly somewhere and paste the first half of one network onto the back half of the other. And if you want to do a mutation, you just pick one of these at random and say I'm going to compare to this instead of this. So you can come up with sort of mutation and crossover operators for this. But then what he did is he was thinking about this competitive coevolution with the leopard and the gazelle. And so he said, okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a population of these sorting networks, and then I'm going to have another population of strings to be sorted. And so the sorting networks are evaluated based on their ability to sort the strings, but the strings are also selected based on their ability to avoid being sorted by the networks. Right, so it becomes a coevolution. He also introduced some kind of partial spatial separation, mimicking what Eldridge and Gould had written about. He was the CEO of this company called, it's a long story, he was the CEO of this company called Thinking Machines, which was like massively parallel computers, and but he was like too far ahead of his time, and people weren't ready for them, and they weren't fast enough compared to normal computers, and the company eventually went out of business, and he went over to work for Disney. But he was at the time looking for things he and Carl Sims, who worked at the same company, they were looking for things to showcase the technology they had with these thinking machines, and so this was one of the things he came up with. And using this, he was able to develop sorting networks that were more efficient than what humans had come up with. And he really, he was the one who kind of introduced this picture, and this is really what was observed, that some strings that the algorithm would kind of converge to certain sorting networks that were pretty good, but then what would happen is that the few strings that those networks were not good at would breed and would increase in the population, and that would effectively change this landscape into that one. So because the ones that they're not good at increase, this is no longer a local optimum, and so they have to move up to another punctuated equilibrium. So this is kind of interesting because it's taking a task and turning it into something competitive. So there could be other opportunities for this where you have an algorithm and then you have some test cases and they could co-evolve with each other. Now I mentioned about a mixture of competitive and so what those situations were completely competitive. What's good for the networks is bad for the strings and vice versa. But people are also interested in situations that are part competitive and part cooperative. And the classic kind of test bed for this is called the iterated prisoner's dilemma. This is where, so everything we previously saw was like a zero-sum game. You know, the score, if the score for the network is +5, then the score for the string is -5. Like it's whatever's good for one player is equally bad for the other. But this is a more general kind of game where the players get rewards specified in this table that are not necessarily the negative of each other. So in this case, each player can choose either C or D, which is known as cooperate or defect. Cooperate means you're going to be nice to the other player. Defect means you're going to be mean to the other player. So if both of you cooperate, you get $3 each. If one cooperates but the other defects, the one who cooperates gets nothing, but the defector gets $5. And if they both defect, they get $1 each. Right? So this is a kind of minimal, interesting scenario because there's this tension. If the two players could both agree on what they're going to do, then they'd both be better off to cooperate. But if you don't know what the other person's going to do, whichever choice the other person makes, you're better off to defect. So there's this kind of tension between what's good for the individual and what's good for the group. And yeah, well, people have studied this from many different aspects, but you know, in the classical situation, let's say you have a population and they're all like evolving and being rewarded based on how much reward they get. You see these kind of cyclic behavior. So what happens is, well, there's this classical strategy. Okay, so I should have said what we normally study is iterated prisoner's dilemma. So iterated means that you play several rounds against the same opponent and you can observe what they did in the previous rounds. Right, so tit for tat is a strategy which is where you do whatever the opponent did on the previous round. So if the opponent cooperated with you on the previous round, then you cooperate with them. But if they defected on you the previous round, then you punish them by defecting on them in this round. So that's called tit for tat. So often what happens is the population sort of temporarily converges to a situation where everyone's playing a tit for tat strategy. But then because everybody's playing tit for tat, you both on the first round you both cooperate. So if you're both playing a tit for tat strategy, you cooperate on the first round and then the second round and then the third round. So you end up always cooperating. So then you kind of get this subpopulation emerging who always cooperate. If everybody else is doing tit for tat and you always cooperate, then you're going to get the same reward that they're getting. So so this can actually sort of take over the population. But then once the population is all cooperating, then there's an opportunity that someone who always defects can exploit the people who are always cooperating. And so that can take over the population. And then when it's all defect, then there's an opportunity for tit for tat to come in and replace all defect. Because if there's a population which is, say, 80% all defect and 20% tit for tat, well, the tit for tat players, when they play against each other, will cooperate. But when they play against all defect, they'll defect. Yeah, so they'll actually get a higher score than the all defect. So there's never any real, I mean, the thing about this iterated prisoner's dilemma, there's never any resolution to this. There's always kind of dynamics and and changes, and so you can go in a cycle, from tit for tat to all C and then all D and then back to tit for tat, and then you can cycle around again. But this is a kind of interesting test case for perhaps, real life situations in the workplace or wherever, or modular systems and different components within a system interacting with each other. There's components of cooperation and competition. And there's also been work on kind of evolution of language and language games where you have an encoder and a decoder, and they're rewarded based on the ability of the encoder to send a message to the decoder. Or sometimes you have a defect. Sometimes it's like an encryption task where you have a sender and a receiver and an eavesdropper, and the sender is trying to deceive the eavesdropper but send the right message to the decoder. Okay, so I'm just mentioning this as like different forms of coevolution, and then of course what I want to concentrate then on is this artist-critic coevolution. So in all of these, the summary here. So coevolution tends to get you out of local minima by providing an opponent of appropriate ability. But it can create new kind of mediocre stable states. And this is what has been observed in GANs, kind of fits into this picture, this mode collapse and cyclic behavior. Okay, any questions about this? Okay. Probably be a bit shorter than usual today. Do you want to take a break, or do you want to just keep going and finish a bit early? Who wants to take a break? Who wants to keep going? You all look pretty fresh. Okay, that's good. Okay, so I mentioned last week this framework of artist-critic coevolution. So you've got an artist and a critic, and the critic is rewarded for distinguishing. You've got a set of real images, and then the critic is rewarded for distinguishing real images from those generated by the artist, and the artist is rewarded for fooling the critic into thinking that generated images are real. So this is sort of another paradigm that also fits into this coevolution framework. And as I mentioned, there's been sort of various things done over the years with different systems playing the role of the artist and the critic. So at first a human played the role of the critic with a blind watchmaker with 15 images appearing on the screen and picking the ones you want. And we looked at the biomorphs, and then we looked at Carl Sims's work, and then the pick breeder. So the images from pick breeder are quite good, but it's a fair bit of work for the human to choose these images, and so it was natural for us to think, well, is there a way to get rid of the human and just replace them with an automated critic? Now, if you look at the early work in this area, which dates from about the early 2000s, the artist was typically, even in the modern work, I guess, the artist is often a genetic program. And often they are acting as a function, as we were talking about before. So they act as a function that takes in an X and a Y value and produces an intensity if it's a black and white image, or red, green, and blue values if it's a color image. There's also, we have done a bit of work where instead of acting as a function, or there's been some work where instead of acting as a function, the artist actually issues drawing commands to draw an image. Now the critic, again, if you go back to this sort of classical work, the critic might be a genetic program as well, or it might be a neural network, but in the early days it wasn't like a fancy neural network, it was just like a two-layer neural network, and instead of reading in the actual image, it would often read in certain statistical features extracted from the image. So it was a kind of indirect method of evaluation. But in any case, the critic is presented with real images from a training set and fake images generated by the artist. And it's trained, usually by backpropagation, to produce an output that's close to 1 for the real images and close to 0 for the generated images, or sometimes vice versa. So with the GANs, it can also vary. Usually it's done the other way around with the GANs, with the 0 and the 1. But it's you see different conventions in the literature. But in our situation, it's convenient to treat the score as a cost rather than a fitness. So if the critic is assigning 0 for real images, then the artist will be trying to get the lowest cost possible. And yeah, different image generating paradigms produce different styles of image. Yeah, so we've got the biomorphs, the genetic programs, pick breeder, cellular automata, and then this is our recent work, and this is some early GAN image. Okay, so I started getting involved in this in a couple of years ago in 2016 with a couple of summer students that I had at the time. And what we did, again, like it was based on a lot on work that had previously done by other people. And these are the images that we produced. So we had so in this case, the artist is not acting as a function, it's actually giving drawing commands to a drawing system. So it's telling a system to change the pen color or put the pen down, move the pen, lift the pen up. And the critic, as I said, is not looking at the image directly, but is looking at certain statistical features. So the features include things like the entropy of all the pixels in the image, or the size of the second largest blob in the image, the second largest region in the image, or these are standard things that can be computed by the OpenCV library. So you take the image, you extract out maybe 20 of these statistical features, you feed them into the critic, and the critic, based on those features, has to try to decide whether the image is real or fake. Now, this is what the drawing commands look like. So the program would produce an instruction 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, and some of them would have a parameter. And so instruction would say to lift the pen off. Toggle means put the pen down or lift it up. Move it forward in whatever direction that you're facing, a certain distance. This is like turtle graphics, basically. Turn a certain angle, set a certain color or grayscale. Now these images, they have their certain sort of naive charm, but they really look like kind of squiggles that a 5-year-old might draw. And so later we did some work where we replaced both the artist and the critic. So in this case, the artist is still, so we went back to this thing of having the artist be a function from XY to RGB, and the critic, instead of having the critic use these kind of statistical features, we actually fed the image itself into a neural network. And it's this was partly inspired by GANs. You know, the critic is basically exactly the same as what you would have in a GAN, but the artist is like a function instead of being a neural network. And we get images that are much higher, will have a different style and of much higher quality. Now, I just briefly described this genetic programming paradigm that we use. So it's a sort of mix between what's called linear genetic programming and stack-based genetic programming. So it's the artist is like a tiny little computation machine that has a stack and some registers and some memory, and every instruction in this language consists of a character that may be preceded by a numerical argument. Yeah. And so there's instructions to fetch the input or scan and write the input buffer. There's a set of instructions for manipulating the stack. So these instructions are kind of based on an old programming language from the 1980s called Forth that was stack-based. A lot of the classical arcade games like Scramble were written in Forth. And so you can push and pop things from the stack, copy the top item of the stack, swap 2 items, rotate 3 items, negate the top item of the stack, add the top 2 items, or multiply the top 2 items. So it's also related to like reverse Polish notation from those old HP calculators. And then there's mathematical functions. You can compute the reciprocal or the square root or the exponential or whatever various functions of the top item of the stack. And there's some instructions that take 2 items from the stack and push 2 new items onto the stack. So this is how you compute trig functions, is basically converting between rectangular and polar coordinates, and there's also an instruction to do divide and modulo. So if you want to compute sine of an angle, you push 1 onto the stack, you compute the trig functions, and then you pop one of the items off. Then there's instructions for loading, getting register value or putting a register value, incrementing and decrementing registers, and getting things from memory. And then there's like branching and jumping instructions. And the evolution paradigm we use here is called hierarchical evolution. Well, there's really 2 points mainly to make about this. So one is that this kind of keeps the number of competing agents small. So with a sort of classical genetic programming paradigm, you might have 200 agents that are all competing with each other, and the computation cost can be high because the way we evaluate these agents is that we get them to draw a picture, and then we feed the picture into the neural network. So the evaluation function is a little bit costly. So if we can use a paradigm it's beneficial to have a paradigm that keeps the number of competing agents relatively small. But then what happens is that when agents get culled from the population, they kind of go into this code bank, and they can still be used for breeding after they're dead. So some people have suggested we should call this necrophilic genetic programming, but I don't know. So it's possible to breed with agents that are recently deceased, and there's also sometimes there's this external library. So in our case, this library consists of agents that have drawn previous pictures, so they can come back and be used for breeding as well. So just to try to maybe make this a little bit more tangible, let me see if I can show you a sequence of images. So well, here's an example. Sorry, let me... So the system chugs away and kind of produces one image every few minutes, basically. So, right, so this is done in phases. So the first critic is... So you start with just a blank image, and then you have some reference images. And so the first critic is just trained to distinguish the blank image from the reference images, which is obviously very simple. And then the first artist is evolved to try to generate an image which that critic will assign a good score to. And then a new critic is trained to reject that image and accept the reference images. So, you know, after you've generated 50 images, the next critic will be trained to reject those 50 images, and then afterwards the next artist will be evolved to try to fool that critic. So the artist can never reproduce an image from the past. It's always got to try new things to try to fool the critic, but often, so you can sort of see in the beginning it produces really very simple images because that's all that's needed, but often it'll take an image from the past and make some changes to it. So just like a real human artist, you kind of see these, experimenting with different styles, and you might find several images which are similar but change in terms of their color or different things like this. And it just produces, images like this one after another, and then, but it's completely automatic. There's no human involvement until the very end, when the human kind of comes in and just looks at all of these images and selects the ones they like. So some evolutionary art is really like a collaboration between a human and a computer, and it's a bit hard to tell who's doing what, but in this system the two roles are very clearly delineated, that the computer is doing all of the image creation, and that then the role of the human is as a curator at the end to sort of look through several hundred images and just pick 10 of them or something like this. So our first set of experiments, we tried this on using the MNIST digit database as the reference images and producing black and white images. And you get, well, as I said, you get this whole sequence of images of sort of varying styles and quality. But after a while, it does sort of start to produce a lot of things that do kind of look like digits. These are the ones that sort of look the most like digits. So you see, it's easy. It finds it easier to produce some digits than others. So it's kind of prefers 8s and 0s, and doesn't often produce a 7 or a 9, but eventually produces some of every type of digit. And also, in the early stages, it often produces things which are very regular in shape like this. But then I think the critic kind of, the critic adapts to realize, oh, well, this shape is actually a bit too regular compared to what a human would draw. So then the artist has to try and draw things a little bit irregular to try to fool the critic. Right, so we get a lot of things that do look like digits, but the other thing is we often get things that don't look like digits, but maybe have their own sort of artistic merit to them. So this looks a bit like an angel or a shopping bag. I particularly like that one. It looks like a digit kind of fell in the water or something. And anyway, that was the MNIST, and then we did a run where with color images where we used this SAFAR 10 data set. So this is this data set that consisted of dogs and ships and trucks and cars. And again, you get something slightly, you do get some sort of interesting results. You get some things that are just very sort of geometric shapes. You get some things that somehow resemble everyday objects. So something might look a bit like a wine glass or a wheel or a spoon, or a row of popsicles, or this one looks a bit like a Christmas ornament. You get some things that look a bit like kind of idealized landscapes, and and then you get things that often they have a bit of an Art Deco kind of flavor to them. Yeah, so this is sort of interesting. But then what happened is well, I'll show you the next set of experiments, but I just make a point here that one of the things that's interesting about this is the idea, there's this sort of idea put forward by Jürgen Schmidhuber and others about low complexity art, that sometimes what we like about art is actually that a scene may have apparent complexity, but there may actually be some underlying algorithmic regularities behind it achieved through self-similarity. So even though if you look at these sort of slightly hokey line drawings, it is kind of interesting. You do see the same kind of structures repeated, but not repeated exactly. They're repeated with slight variations. So this and this look a little bit different, and here there's sort of a coherence. There's certain sort of lines in a recognizable pattern, but they're all a little bit sort of different. And this is, I mean, if you look at some of the images generated by early GANs, they do look pretty realistic, but you can kind of tell, well, real images often do, whether they're natural or man-made, often do have this kind of self-similarity. So in these windows all kind of look similar to each other, and here you get the structures on the plant that look, again, similar to each other but with slight variations, and often this is missing in a kind of classical GAN, right? So, but this is something that with our evolutionary system, there is this this system, there's a selective pressure that tries to make these programs shorter. Okay, so the other thing, yeah, I mean, I showed when we did, so these first images here were like 2 years ago, and people sort of looked at this and said, yeah, well, that's interesting, but I don't think that any human artist would be shaking in their shoes thinking they were going to be out of a job anytime soon, which is probably fair enough. And then when we started, I showed these images to an artist friend of mine in San Francisco, and he sort of said, yeah, well, they look a bit interesting, but they're all sort of random. They don't really depict anything in particular. And I mean, that's the other thing, there's not much relation to the reference images. So here, because they were trained on images that included different types of object, you kind of lose the significance of it. But it is sort of interesting in a way. You could train something on images of dogs and trucks, and somehow it ends up with something that looks like a Christmas ornament. Yeah, that's sort of something weird. But he said, you know, art, people want art that has a context, has a theme, has a subject and a backstory, and people want that sort of context. Okay, so the latest, this is sort of the latest project in this series that I've been working on, is I took pictures of 10 famous landmarks and went through this process with each of those 10 landmarks. I did a Google search for pictures of that object, and then I did this process and generated, several hundred images, and then just picked out, or in 2 different runs, and tried to pick out, 5 that I like the best. So we're going to play this game where you try to guess what the famous landmark is. So what do you think this is? Exactly. So it's definitely, it's definitely recognizable as the Sydney Opera House, right? Now, this is very sort of, so here's the thing. I mean, the idea with GANs, of course, is to produce images that are as realistic as possible. Now, these images, obviously, we would not be fooled into thinking we're looking at a real image, but to me, the interesting thing is that they may reveal something to us about modern art and about the way it fools the human visual system. Because so one way it achieves this is by minimalism. It just it only recreates the kind of general outline of the object, and sometimes it looks pretty much sort of two-dimensional. Sometimes shading is added to give it a bit of a three-dimensional quality, and sometimes it has a bit of a luminescent quality as well. What about this one? The pyramids, yes. In Egypt, and again you see this kind of minimalism. Now, the other thing that modern art movements exploit is the fact that humans, the human visual system often responds to relative colour rather than absolute colour. If you look at Impressionist art and Fauvist art, they often play around with the colours and change the colours of different objects. And again, we're not fooled into thinking that when we look at those artworks, we're not fooled into thinking we're looking at a photograph, but part of the appeal is that they kind of stimulate our visual system and make us a bit, throw us a little bit off balance what we're actually looking at. And the same sort of thing happens here with the colours. So, the pyramids, it might, well, these images actually contained really 3 pyramids, and so sometimes it would try to model that with a kind of round shape, but the colour might become red instead of brown, and so on. Sorry, where were we? This one's a bit tricky. Can anyone guess what these images are supposed to be? Sorry? Which? Mount Everest is a good guess. The Great Wall of China. It's actually this place in Peru called Machu Picchu, but I mean, you probably get similar results from those other places. So you get sort of a mountain with a bit of a ancient city in the foreground. So again, you see this kind of minimalism. But here you do see shading effects, so this really is just trying to this is really only just trying to model the 2 hills, but you see there's a bit of shading added to give it a bit of three-dimensionality, and some of these things have shading effects as well. Here there's kind of lighting, it's brighter in the middle than at the edges. To create a kind of lighting effect. Okay, what about this? Golden Gate Bridge. So this is interesting. So this idea, so this pressure to have a small program sometimes results in kind of fractal fractal geometry. So this, I'll show you a higher res version of this later, but this image here actually, it's a little bit like the art of an artist called M.C. Escher. It's these beams are reflected in the water, but it's a bit hard to tell where the actual object ends and the reflection begins, and it's hard to tell where the boundary between the sky and the water is. So your eye is kind of led around different places trying to see those boundaries that aren't really there. And then here again with the color and the shading, here there's very little color, but it creates an image using shading instead. And this also uses fractals to create an image of depth. And this one here is a bit interesting too. Like the beams of the bridge have become like, window blinds or something, and then there's this kind of weird ethereal landscape in the background. And sometimes you get sort of things looking like other objects, like this actually maybe looks like a bunch of scarves hanging on a washing line, but somehow it does remind us a bit of the bridge. What about this? Sorry? Some sort of tower, yeah. It doesn't really matter. It's actually based on the Eiffel Tower. You see again, you see some weird things happening here. I mean, that looks like aliens coming down and landing. I like this one. It looks like some naughty giant pulled up the tower and turned it upside down or something. And here you get an interesting kind of pointillation. So if this function, the function that on these x and y values, if it changes very rapidly, then you get this kind of random pattern of dots. It's kind of this weird sort of starlight effect. Yeah, and if you blow this image up to higher resolution, the pattern, the details of the pattern, you still have a pattern of dots, but they're kind of in different places. Yeah. Now, this is based on a famous tree in South Carolina called the angel oak tree. And again, it's sort of interesting what happens here. So sometimes you just get these kind of wavy lines or some kind of abstract representation, but you see a lot of use of fractals here. So fractals are used to generate this and these, and that one's particularly interesting, or it looks better in high resolution, but somehow this was not trained on images of an insect, it was trained on images of a tree, but somehow it generates something that looks like a insect. Yeah. And again, all of these images are just like untouched by human hands. It's just what the algorithm came up with.
What was the critic for these?
This one was pictures of this tree. Yeah. Any guesses? What kind of object is this, you think? Sorry? Not the we're getting to the Taj Mahal. This is actually, it's Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. But again, this interesting use of fractals. So some of them are just wild, crazy fractals. I don't know why that has any relation to the building. But here you have, sorry? The middle, yeah, I think so. So this one actually produces that middle bit very well. I mean, again, this kind of goes back to, we were looking last week at this issue of how convolutional networks are easily fooled. I mean, I think the fact that we're using these rectified linear units means that it's kind of a semi-linear accumulation of evidence. So if certain parts of the image, if certain features in the image are very well represented, the network will accept that image even if other parts are missing because of this kind of semi-linearity. And I think that's sort of what's going on here. The center of the image is rendered very accurately here in the sort of general circular shape, but everything else is somehow missing. And like you were talking about this image here, like the center, it's kind of, yeah, it's actually that texture there is very kind of radially symmetric, and that's being captured very well here, and it's willing to accept it, even though the rest is missing. So to me, this idea that networks can be easily fooled is my way. To me, it's interesting from this point of view. Well, is there something? Do they have some similarity with the human visual system that can also be fooled? Yeah.
Could this also say something about the simple or the focus of the artist, or how the actual program to take a particular?
Yes. I think it could, yeah, because it could be a general tendency of the. I mean, I should say this evolutionary thing. I developed this without any. I developed for totally other tasks, classification and control and things like that. So I had no idea of ever using it to generate images. So I've tried to make a system that has as little bias as possible, but it may still have a bias. Well, it may have a bias towards. Well, it has a bias towards low complexity. So it may be just a general principle that certain shapes do have low complexity and do a pretty good general job. But the other thing is when you do a particular run, it's always kind of reworking previous images. So if it starts off with if it generates certain types of images, then it may reuse those images. Yeah. And then, I think I just find, you see again, like interesting use of fractals. And this one is a kind of sort of cartoon version, but somehow has some relation to this as well. We're nearly, there's only a couple more, I think. Who said the Taj Mahal? This is actually the Taj Mahal. So it struggles to really render the Taj Mahal, but somehow sometimes you see just these very simple outlines, and then you see the use of fractals. So this, here you see the sort of general idea of a domed structure and then the reflecting pool. This one, the reflecting pool's been kind of tilted sideways somehow. It's a little bit like those, like you're on one of those one of those big water slides or something. And here again, you get the fractals. So occasionally, there's this sort of been this thing in modern art. That occasionally people will exhibit, a canvas that really looks blank, but when you look closely, it's got some sort of texture and stuff. So very occasionally something like this may happen in this system. You get an image that actually looks blank, but when you zoom in, there's actually some fine structure in there which is somehow fooling the critic. Yeah, and this looks just totally off the wall. I don't know, it's like I don't know if it's a totem pole or a bird with funky sunglasses, but then when you look at this, you kind of can sort of see like it's rendering this part here as a cross beam, and then there is some sort of structure that it's pulling out here in a weird way. Now this one's a bit even more funky. This is from a building, but I don't know. It doesn't really look like it, but it's actually like St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. But again, you see this interesting use of fractals. So these images here, what might look a bit like fractal or psychedelic artworks, that's using fractals to kind of create this image of a tower. This one here, again, this looks a bit weird. It's just a sort of cartoon, but you can kind of see where this is coming from. So you've got the tower in the middle, and then you've got a blue turret on that side and a red one on that side. So it's kind of using the colors because of that. And then there's green here and here in this statue. So it's got the green bits there. It's got the dark bits at the side. So there is sort of some weird logic to this. And then again, there's sort of metaphor. So sometimes you train it on one set of images. So this top right image looks kind of like a flower, but it wasn't trained on images of flowers. It was trained on images of this building. But maybe the building was originally designed to look like a flower. Maybe it's somehow like extracting out the original intention, and then this one is even more weird somehow. This is actually I don't know what happened. This is taken off images of the Grand Canal in Venice, but it really struggles with this. So you get pretty abstract looking things, but again, there is some logic to this. Like if you look at this image here that looks like a boat bumping into something, you kind of at first you scratch your head like, why is there a boat there? But then if you look at one of the original images, somehow it's actually mistaken this roof here for the front of a boat, and it thinks that this bit here is the boat, and that bit's that curvy bit is the sail, and then there's some other sloping structure over here. So somehow it actually kind of extracts out things that we didn't notice, and then you get these really weird kind of things here. So here fractals are used to create this texture of kind of reeds and stuff, but it kind of reflects the fact that there's a lot of vertical structure in here and not very much horizontal, so it's kind of extracts that out. And even this image, so that image looks perhaps the weirdest of all in some sense. It just looks like a random assortment of dots, but even that image, you kind of get the impression that something's reflected in the water, and there's open space here and more structure here. So there's something even to these kind of image. Okay, so I don't know. It sort of depends on what kind of thing you like. Maybe I'll just show you a couple of higher resolution images, higher resolution versions of some of these images, so you can get a better idea. So that's that insect thing at higher resolution. And again, the program that generates this is actually very short, maybe 100 characters or something. But that's the beauty of these fractals, is you can zoom in and you see more and more detail at high resolution. So you can blow these things up to a very large size, and they still look interesting in some sense. That's that just weird supernova kind of one. This is the one that I said was a bit like MC Escher. It looks a bit better at higher resolution. What else have we got? There's that fractal one. I don't know what human artist to compare this to. It's just very weird, but it does kind of look a little bit like a cathedral, the outline of a building. So the punctillation, so some of these images, this is one of the Great Pyramid ones, and again, this is sort of interesting. The pattern is very regular at the edge, but then becomes more random as we move to the center. And this, no matter what resolution you blow it up, this is even higher resolution. So you get this interesting kind of texture here that looks a bit like wood that's been painted or something like that. But then you see in the middle these random dots that create this pattern. So it's sort of like you're looking at this vast desert, and you can see the individual grains of sand. And I don't know, you get the same kind of weird texture on this moon thing with kind of weird stripes. And this one, depending on what resolution you render it at, the nature of the thing sort of changes a little bit. So at the low resolution, we had some structure over here. Now it's a little bit different. So it's a bit hard to say what for this image, it's a bit hard to say what the reality really is. And then, just a couple more examples. So this is that stardust effect with the tower. You can see, the dots are in different locations, but you still get this impression of dots. And if I can just go back to, just to go back to this image here, I have a script that actually goes through and tries to build a tree structure to extract out the relationship between the different images, but you can kind of see here, it's almost like there's a series with different, so it kind of tries out the same idea over and over with slightly different variations of color and so on. As I said, the same way the human artist might do. But I don't know, every one of these images looks okay to the critic of that generation. Actually, there's a lot of these. From the critic's point of view, all of these are okay, but somehow as humans, some of these just really look pretty ugly to us. But then eventually it kind of picks a certain arrangement of colors that for some reason looks a lot better. So there's obviously something additional that the human is adding, that the critic, if we could automate it's not much work, I guess, to go through and select these images, but maybe one day that part of the process can also be automated somehow. I don't know.
What kind of parameters were the critic given in this case?
The architecture of the critic. Yeah, so it's based on the Linnet architecture that we talked about early on. So you've got two convolutional layers and then two fully connected layers. You've got a convolutional layer and then a pooling layer. and then a second convolutional layer, and then another pooling layer, and then a fully connected layer.
Okay.
And
Is just the actual.
the input is just...
It's not like attributes like the color.
No, in this case, the input is the actual image. Yeah, it's the actual image. Now, we did vary the resolution of the images and the number of features. So the early work that we did with the CIFAR, we only had 6 features at the first convolutional layer. I think we had 6 at the first layer and 12 at the next layer, which actually, is very little. So in this one, I increased it to 16. So the general architecture is the same, but there's now 16 features at the first level and 24 at the next level. So increase the number of features. And we tried 2 different resolutions. One was 48 by 48. The other was 64 by 64. So all those images that I showed you, the top row was like the critic was looking at 48 by 48, and the lower row they were looking at 64 by 64. Interestingly, it's hard to sort of say whether one's better than the other. We also introduced a bit of data augmentation. So we allow the image to move by 1 or 2 pixels because that's one of the things with this is the number of reference images is very small here. It's between like 8 and 50 or something. So it's very few images. So the data augmentation seems to improve, seems to give an improvement in most cases. But there's certain situations, like the Eiffel Tower. I had some earlier images of the Eiffel Tower that actually perhaps are superior. It's possible that it's a bit hard to say, but it's possible that the Eiffel Tower, because it's always photographed from such a fixed kind of position, I don't know, maybe the data augmentation is just kind of confusing it or something. But it's really hard to say because you do one run and you don't know if you would have got different results if you did another run. So this is actually, this shows the actual resolution at which the critic is seeing the images. Yeah, it's kind of lower resolution than what I was showing before.
And will the reference images similarly framed?
Generally, yes. So let me show you an example of some reference images. So here's the Opera House, for example. I tried to kind of select images. Often I try to select images where it's photographed from a particular angle. Yeah, so it's kind of makes the job easier for the artist in a way, I suppose, but also gives it some extra coherence. I'm trying to find... let me just try to find that earlier Eiffel Tower thing. Hang on.
And were you using TensorFlow for this or another?
TensorFlow, yeah. Let me just see if this one opens. I think I've got too many windows open. This isn't going to open. This refuses to open, I think. Or maybe it's already open. Yeah?
So if you're training on Raiji, were you using multiple graphics cards? And how did you have to adjust the network?
Okay, good question. Yeah, right. And, well, in most cases, yeah, to be honest, this process doesn't lend itself that well to massive parallelization. So I tried running on just two CPUs, and I tried running on like 2 GPUs plus 6 CPUs. For the larger resolution network, the GPUs do speed it up significantly. Well, it speeds it up maybe by a factor of 4 or something. For the small resolution network, it probably only doubles the speed, so then it's questionable whether it's worthwhile to use the GPUs, because it doesn't, like, it's like you generate one image. So what happens is so one process is just running the network, and it's just sitting and waiting, and then when it receives an image, it processes it and sends the result back. Now, if you had a genetic program, there are other kinds of genetic program that are naturally very parallel. Maybe you'd get some benefit from parallelization in that case. Or I don't know about GPUs, but certainly multiple CPUs. But this paradigm is kind of deliberately designed to be serially efficient, I guess. Yeah. Good question. Yeah, I'm having trouble finding this. Oh, yeah, I don't know. I think it's just. Oh, yeah, there we go. Yeah. So this that image in the middle is quite interesting in a way. Like, it uses fractals to actually produce the. It uses fractals to try to reproduce the texture, the texture of the tower.
If it's using fractals, does that mean that the image is defined recursively or something? Like, is it literally an infinite, like, fractal?
It is an infinite fractal, yeah. If you can blow it up to any resolution, you can blow these images up to any resolution, and you would always see more and more detail. Oh, this is another. This is actually trained off a single image of the Mona Lisa. So again, this is weird kind of modern art, really. Like, you can't. The face is totally missing, but it kind of creates the impression of a woman looking sideways. Yeah, all of these fractal images. Oh, yeah. Well, like I say, this is probably the best example. You can see. There's actually, these just look like stripes, but when you zoom in, you can see there's stripes within the stripes. Yeah, so there's extra details that become apparent at every level. Yeah.
Why is it that these convolutional networks are so good at identifying the real images when we just train them on images, but so bad at distinguishing between real and fake images in this case? Does it mean that it's all along we're just relying on something that was completely unrelated to the image? It was just relying on colors and things like that?
Oh, well, I think it's. Well, I'm not the question. Well, I think GANs. I mean, I think the real answer to that question is that GANs are now very good at producing good real images, right? So it's not the fault of the critic. So the fact that GANs can produce very realistic looking images suggests that it's about the generator. Like, what's happening here is that the generator isn't very good. The generator is very poor at producing real images but it's got a bias towards something else. Yeah.
So it's not the critic not being able to distinguish between the generated and real images.
I think that's right. I mean, this network isn't. Also, the critic isn't particularly deep, but it's reasonable. Yeah, it's kind of a.
What do you think is the main factor in so are you saying like there's the ones out there that use evolution networks that are really good, but then this one isn't for some reason? I'm not sure what the reason is. Is it really like process intensive?
Well, people have used evolutionary art. Well, like I say, there's a very great variety of things, and often a human is involved along the way with the process. But people have also tried to generate art using GANs. But it's sort of a different process because you give it artworks drawn by humans, and then you ask it to try to reproduce the style of the human. But then if you're going to do that, then neural style transfer might be a better approach.
So is this more effective on I guess not actual pictures, but in artworks, I guess, where it's more so about the shapes and colors as opposed to fine-grained detail like an house?
Yeah. I mean, you've got to think of this as like an artificial modern artist, I guess, rather than a photographer or something. Yeah.
What steps do you think would need to be taken to make it more complicated, to move towards photorealism?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. Yeah, I mean, what do you think? Well, I mean, I guess part of the question is what's the objective? Is the objective to create real-looking images, or is the objective to create artwork which is not quite realistic but more sophisticated than this? Or
I think I'm asking to make the network recognize complete objects or complete reflections or those sorts of features to recreate things like that.
Well, that is a good question. I mean, because I suppose in the end, what we really want to do is be able to generate movies. I mean, eventually, I suppose we want to have a situation where you're going to invite some friends over and say, I want to watch a movie that's kind of like Toy Story, but has Cary Grant and Lauren Bacall and Robin Williams. And then it'll chug away for 20 minutes and then produce the movie for you. I mean, this may happen in the future. We may reach a point where the idea of inviting people over to watch an old movie is just really passé. People just want to watch new things that are generated on the spot. So if we wanted to do that, it's an interesting question, would you use GANs or would you try to use some sort of 3D rendering software or some combination of the two? These are very interesting questions, and I guess this is the other thing about art. So there's this revolution, no one buys a newspaper anymore, they just look online. People don't want to sit down and read a whole book. They want to just read a quick blog or something. So the same kind of process might eventually happen to the art world. Instead of paying $20,000 for an artwork and hanging it on your wall for 20 years, maybe people will prefer to just have something that's ephemeral and small and generated, and they can appreciate it for a while and then move on to something else. I mean, it's really hard to say. I don't know. What is the future of art? But one way or another, you've got to question, eventually with some technique, human artists, maybe their jobs aren't safe either. I don't know. Musicians.
Maybe it could be more a tool for artists in the meantime, coming up with new ideas. Like
That's right. Yeah.
these kind of algorithms.
Yeah. And I guess GANs could be used in that way too. I don't know if there's been much work in that direction, but like. Any other questions? Yes?
Will it be possible, like, if I give it a different model of a car and ask him to generate a new model or new shape, like most of the companies does nowadays, like you just change that, give it a new shape or lights, maybe instead of generating just a random.
Yeah, so if we just go back up a bit to the evolutionary computation, yes, it has been used for that kind of thing. So I have a colleague called Xin Yao who was in Birmingham for many years, and he's done work with car companies and other, like Honda will come to him and say, we want a new aerodynamic design for our car, or this, they'll use evolutionary computation to actually do that kind of optimization. Or sometimes a rival company has a patent on something, and they say, well, we can't afford to infringe this patent, but we want you to design something for us that serves the same purpose to some extent without infringing the patent, So it's used in that case for optimization.
Has anyone tried, the one where there was two virtual creatures?
Yes.
Tried other algorithms to see if they behave differently, or other techniques?
The virtual creatures. Yeah, well, this was controversial at the time because Carl Sims he refused to kind of release his code to other people, and they were suspicious about what parameters were in his system, whether he kind of like fudged it somehow. But I think there are open source systems now that do similar things that you can play around with. Yeah. But yeah, you can fiddle with the size of the population and the tournament structure. Like let's say you've got 20 agents. Do they all compete against each other in a round robin? Or do they all just compete against the best agent from the previous round? Or do you have do you have like population A and B, and A only always competes with B? I mean, you play around with these sort of things, you get different results as well. Any other questions or comments?
Is there a particular reason why you use evolution networks as opposed to other networks?
I think it just I don't know. I just thought it would be interesting, but I think it does tend to produce this thing with the low algorithmic complexity, like this fractal structure, and I mean this really illustrates a lot of structures in nature do have this kind of fractal structure because of the way develop. Yeah, so it's, I mean, but it's interesting, so sort of a traditional neural network, like a GAN, if you think about a traditional GAN, it doesn't really make use of this kind of self-similarity in an image. You know, I mean, they're using the same convolutional features, but there's nothing that would force one part of the image to be similar to another. But the human visual system, there is something in the human visual system that's picking up on this. So it would be very interesting to try to explore a kind of hybrid approach. Like take a convolutional network, but make some modification to it or something. I don't know exactly. This could be an interesting avenue for future research. I mean, if someone was asking what's missing in terms of convolutional networks, maybe compared to the human brain, yeah, I mean, there's sort of explicit object recognition. So like you've got systems like YOLO that do object detection, but you could build a more integrated system that identifies one object in an image and then uses that to deduce what the identity of another object, sort of thing.
Generate things that just identify things, really.
Right, but you could. Right. So, is there a generative equivalent of YOLO? Yeah.
Are there other applications of evolutionary networks that are like particularly notable right now, or like projected to be in the future to be useful with evolutionary networks?
Evolutionary networks. Yeah. I didn't. Okay. So, there's been a lot of work by this OpenAI. The people at OpenAI have done a lot of work recently, and some Uber and some others, about applying using an evolutionary algorithm to adapt the weights of a neural network to play Atari games and this kind of stuff. There's also, I didn't talk about this, but there's a separate track where they evolve the structure of the network as well. I got one student who's working on that, and there's a bit of work, I think, being done on that. I think I saw a recent paper where someone was doing this even for Atari. But yeah, so there's a few things going on. It's like neural networks were out of fashion for a long time and suddenly became very trendy. Maybe the same thing will happen with evolution. Who knows? Any other questions? Comments? Good. Oh, yes?
Unrelated, but are you going to do a revision lecture?
Next week will be a kind of revision lecture. Yeah. Yeah?
So are there any stopping parameters of evolution, like the evolution as we speak, or cannot improve anymore?
Stopping parameters of evolution.
Yeah, it's no use to further evolve or to do genetic programming. So like when we take the good parameters of the children and then we again subdivide. So we know like it's further no use to further subdivision or taking a good grandchildren.
So the question is whether do you know whether evolution has reached its peak? I don't know, have we reached our evolutionary peak? Maybe we can still be improved upon. I mean, I don't know, this is I think there's a lot to this idea of punctuated equilibria. And this is maybe just one example of this, like, I kind of know that, I recognize that this is a long process, but you know, every one of these images is a mini evolution that most of the time probably get stuck in some local optimum, but then you train a new critic and you start a new evolution. So I think if you've, maybe this is another future direction, is if you have like a multi-agent system, one agent may get stuck in a local minimum for some period of time, but then if other agents are changing, eventually the change in the other agents may spur this one to change. Yeah, so maybe the real method for escaping from local optima lies in interaction rather than changing the algorithm itself. I don't know. Yeah.
Is there much work done on multiple critics for an actor? Or is that a concept?
Multiple critics. These are good questions. Multiple critics for an actor. Yeah, so there's this risk that one critic, yeah, maybe you're fooling the current critic but not a previous critic. So when we did the really simple one, we actually kept the previous critics and we evaluated on all of them and took a weighted sum. But with the neural networks, it's kind of too expensive to do that because you'd have to save the weights at every iteration. But we did some analysis to try to indirectly see whether we were getting stuck in a local optimum or not. Like we tried a few different paradigms to do with training on all of the previous images versus training on only some limited number of them. And we also tried like retraining the critic from the beginning versus like taking the weights from the previous critic and using them as the starting point of the next critic. So I could talk more about that afterwards if you're interested, yeah. But yeah, you could potentially have multiple critics that are focusing on different aspects, yeah, if you've got the computation power for it. Good. Okay, I'll see you next week then.